Welcome to Back to the Father, a show about the journey of life focused on our final end, which is God Himself, our loving Father. And now, here's your host, Dave Palmer.
And welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of Back to the Father here on the Guadalupe Radio Network. This is a production of the GRN. We do it once a week, and I am so proud of ourselves because I think this may be 4 weeks in a row that we have done this show, and I know it's been a little off and on, here and there, hit and miss, but we are taking it very seriously now. We are so happy that you're joining us. We are on all the social media platforms of the GRN, including YouTube and Facebook and X and Rumble and TikTok and Instagram, or all the, I normally just monitor a couple of them because I just can't keep track of it. Sorry for the title. I just imagine people, scrolling through the internet and seeing the wedding of metaphysics and personalism. Just like, oh my goodness, be still my beating heart. But it's not going to be as dry as the title may appear. It's actually a great title once you find out exactly what we're talking about here. And I know there's probably few words that are less enticing in titles of social media posts than metaphysics. So I apologize. It's just, I don't know, something about that word. I love metaphysics, but I don't think it generally is a real crowd pleaser. I don't know what you think about that, Sissel.
I mean, it's not the typical cocktail party conversation starter. I'm not sure. I could be wrong. You're hanging
out at the wrong cocktail parties. Okay,
clearly.
So, all right. So, anyways, we got a few people here, and if the past is any indication of what's going to happen today, we might have some international folks. Last week we had someone from New Zealand and India. We had somebody named Muhammad. I'm not sure where Muhammad was from, but he never identified himself. So first thing you do is just tell us where you're watching from, and I want to give you an idea of what we'll be talking about, because if that title, The Wedding of Metaphysics and Personalism, grabbed you, that's great. And I had 2 different topics that I was considering for today, and one of them was based on the conversation that I had with my colleague Julian Placino, and he and I had done an interview for GRN Academy because I'm teaching a class on the dignity of the human person, and I said, just give me your honest take. I said, don't try to make me feel good. Because during the interview I said, did it make sense? Was it something that you could understand what I was talking about? Because we were talking about this kind of stuff in the Summa Theologia. And he said, yeah, it did. But then he said, sometimes on Back to the Father, it's a little bit deep. He said, sometimes, when I tune into Back to the Father, it can get a little bit deep. And so I said, you got to be able to explain something at such a level that a grade schooler could understand it. And so I had the idea of explaining the Summa Theologia as if I was talking to like a 4th grade class.
Can we make it a 2nd grade? Because I am the class. I am part of the class here. Can we just...
And I actually ran this by my mom. My mom's a pretty regular viewer of this show. She never comments, but she's always out there, watching it. And she said, oh, I love that idea. And I decided not to do that for a couple of reasons. First of all, I didn't have time to prepare, because I think the more simple you do something, sometimes you have to prepare even a little bit more. And also, I didn't want to make it sound like I was talking down to the audience, like you guys are a bunch of, 2nd graders. And so we'll do that another time to be able to explain the Summa Theologia as if, I was talking to a grade school class, which would be pretty interesting. It's actually something kind of near and dear to my heart, because I wrote a book called St. Thomas Aquinas for Everyone. And that's the whole premise of it, is being able to teach adults to teach basic principles of Thomistic philosophy, Christian philosophy, to youngsters. I mean, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, because I think it can happen. All right. So if you're out there, let us know where you are, who you are. And Sissel will have an eagle eye on the comments. Any comments yet?
I do. Yes, I'd like to bring up a couple comments.
We already comments. Okay,
yes,
good.
Yes, we do. Good. We have Dennis watching from San Antonio joining us. He says hello. And we have Rudro. Yeah, they might not be saying that right. I'm so sorry. But he's on YouTube from Bangladesh. So we got San Antonio to Bangladesh. I love that. So
Which
awesome.
one do you think is more exotic?
San Antonio or blank? Bangladesh.
I'm just giving Dennis a hard
I
time. Did
was
you
like,
meet Dennis at the 25th anniversary
I did
event?
meet
Yeah.
Dennis then. He's lovely. And I also am glad that you clarified that this wasn't the class for fourth graders
Yeah.
because I was like, man, you put metaphysics in the title of a class that's supposed to be taught for fourth graders. That's
And,
great.
Metaphysics, and I'll ask, Dennis and our friend from Bangladesh, anybody else who's out there right now, when you hear the word metaphysics, does that, remember Mario last week said, metaphysics, I'm out of here, and you just like the very title of it. It's a complicated word, and but I find it fascinating because we are going to be talking about it today. And metaphysics, in kind of the definition form, is just like the study of existence, the study of, you could say, ontology of being, or as Dr. Peter Kraft said, when a child, is 2 years old and he walks around and he says, "What's that? What's that?" And he points to the thing and he says, "What's that?" That child is being a metaphysician because he's looking out at the world and he's trying to figure out what exists and what kind of holds it all together. And so that's kind of what metaphysics is. It's actually a fascinating thing because it's all encompassing. And if you take a big picture of what's out there and how, how does God fit into the picture of it, that's kind of what you're talking about with metaphysics. So the basis of the program today, and I'd love to get your feedback. It's hard to just give a monologue, and Sissel does a great job of contributing as she is able. But the whole idea is based on a lecture that I saw recently by Dr. Peter Kraft, who I mentioned a moment ago. And he did a 12-part lecture series for Word on Fire, which is Bishop Robert Barron's organization, which absolutely amazes me, that group. I mean, they are just putting out content left and right. And I mean, Bishop Barron is a extremely impressive guy. And I know Sissel's sister Tova works for Word on Fire, but I don't know if I get a lot of stuff in my feed. Maybe they just know that I like philosophy, but they are really, really putting out a lot of good stuff.
They put out a lot of different things, but they do definitely focus on philosophy, I could admit, too.
And Bishop Barron, I don't know if you ever watch his videos. That guy is really smart. And he's got that combination of being able to present very well and also being like really uber smart. And so I'm very impressed with him. He's very much of a Thomist. He loves St. Thomas Aquinas. And so getting back to Dr. Peter Kraft, he did this 12-part series based on a box set of books that he did, and it was called Socrates' Children. And I have read that box set 2 times, and I'll probably read it, several more times in my life, I hope. It's really good. It's the history of philosophy. And what Dr. Peter Kraft does is he sets up these kind of duels, like Socrates versus the sophists, or St. Thomas Aquinas versus Averroes, or whatever. This person versus that person. And so the first 11 in the series is always kind of pitting one philosopher against another. And there's always one that Peter Kraft prefers over the other. But then in the 12th of lectures of this series, he says he's not pitting one philosopher against another, but he's talking about a marriage. And that marriage that he has in mind is what he calls Thomistic metaphysics. Okay, so the way that St. Thomas Aquinas kind of sees the world, sees the big picture. And I'm going to get into a little bit of that today. And then also modern personalism. And I wish I could put a link on these pages because it's about a 40-minute video, and I've already watched it 5 times, and I'm going to just keep on watching it until it makes sense to me. But it's absolutely fascinating because Peter Kraft thinks that this is the next stage of philosophy, because he said the Thomistic metaphysicians and the modern personalists, and I'll kind of explain this a little bit more, don't really get along. But he said there's really no reason why these two can't be wedded together. So the video is talking about how, the Thomas's view of the whole world and how it all comes together, and the modern view of personalism, which is more of a subjective way of looking at the world. Remember a moment ago I said that the child looks around and says, what's that? What's that? That's more metaphysics. It's when you're trying to figure out what's in the world. But Peter Kreeft says that modern personalism is kind of like a teenager that's coming of age and wants to know, like, who am I? How do I fit into the world? So if you figure metaphysics is objective, trying to figure out the world, personalism is subjective, like, how do I fit in? And so what he's saying there is that if you take Aquinas's metaphysics, what is in the world, modern day personalism, how do I fit into the world? And you bring them together, he said that's going to be the key. That's where philosophy needs to go next. And I am not as bright as Peter Kreeft or certainly Bishop Barron, but I think I know what they're getting at. And I think it's a really exciting prospect of exploring this. And that's what we're going to do in this video. And I really do, like I said, I want your feedback. It doesn't mean you got to understand it entirely, because if you had to understand it entirely to be, commenting, then I wouldn't be saying anything, okay? Because I don't understand it entirely either. But I think it's a fun discussion to have. And if you think this is kind of like, I don't know if this is really that important, you might want to know that back in 1961, a Polish gentleman by the name of Karol Wojtyła, perhaps that name rings a bell.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah.
Got a little bell.
Yeah,
Yes.
Karol Wojtyła, who was to, in 61, that would have been about 17 years later, would become Pope John Paul II. He wrote a 10-page paper, which he called Thomistic Personalism. Okay, this is Karol Wojtyła, 15, 16 years before he became Pope, as a bishop in Krakow, Poland. What was on his mind? Thomistic personalism. Exactly what we're talking about here. Okay, this was on the mind of the future Pope. And what he thought was that he foresaw a lot of the issues that were going to be hitting the human person. Confusion about ethics, confusion about what a person is, the things that we're dealing with today, where there is a lot of confusion. And he said, you know what, this is what we've got to focus on. And so let's use St. Thomas Aquinas and his metaphysics, and then let's use some of the modern personalism out there, and let's see if we can kind of wed it together. All right, so here we are. Gosh, how many years later? From 61 to, this is like 60 years later? I mean, this is a long time. I mean, from 61 to 2025, I mean, that's a long time. So we're still trying to work it out. And, Dr. Peter Kreeft, he's an older gentleman. I don't know how much longer we're going to have him. I hope many years. But he's kind of put the challenge out there. And I think he's saying, younger philosophers, let's do this. Let's see if we can find this combination. So today is going to be my first foray into just at least introducing it and saying, what do you think? Do you think we could do this? And see if I can make it make sense. I don't think I'm going to explain this as if it was for a second grader, but I'll do the best I can. So, Sissel, you jump in. Any other comments? Because
Dennis just mentioned that he really enjoys. Oh no, I've lost it. There he is. He really enjoyed the Philosopher's Bench series, which is by Dr. I'm pretty sure that's Dr. Peter Kreeft as well, isn't it? Is that the one is it the Socrates Meet Jesus? Is that the Philosopher's Bench?
Yeah. Well,
bench?
I'm not.
I don't remember if that's what that's called.
I haven't heard it called that, but
so maybe I'm wrong then.
The Philosopher's Bench. Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe Dennis can explain a little bit better what he's talking about. But there is a series of Socrates meets, you fill in the blank, Nietzsche, Marx, Heidegger, Kant, Descartes. And I've read a lot of those. And what it is like they meet in the afterworld. And that's kind of the premise, is that they're having this conversation after they've already left the world. But it's pretty interesting. So, so Karol Wojtyła wrote about this in 1961, and I want to start off today with the same slide that I started with last week, and not because I'm totally uncreative and I couldn't think of a new slide, but I want to kind of go back to that. And so Sissel will pop up this first slide that we have, and it has to do with Thomas's remark or comment in the Summa, which I think is very significant is that he said, person signifies what is most perfect in all of nature. I love that. Person signifies what is most perfect in all of nature. A person is a subsistent individual of a rational nature. And not to go over too much about what we talked about last week, but the only persons in the world are the three persons of the Blessed Trinity, every single angel, and then us. Okay, so persons are what is most perfect in all of nature. And what Dr. Peter Kraft is going to kind of conclude his lecture with is that he says not only is the person the most perfect thing in all of nature, but he said the sanctified saint is the culmination of metaphysics. So think about that. If metaphysics is everything that's out there, and the sanctified saint, which obviously is a person, it means that God is working so powerfully through the human person who is most fully sanctified and most perfectly reveals God himself, that's the perfection of all being. Okay, so I don't know. I think it's pretty interesting. So the second slide talks about this Thomistic metaphysics in modern personalism. And if you're out there, whether you're in San Antonio or Bangladesh or New Zealand, if you have any questions, anything kind of clarifying that you want to know about, just stop me and I'll do my best to try to explain it. So the basic premise, okay, now I'm going to try to explain this as if I was teaching a second grade class, okay? So you see if this makes sense.
Perfect,
okay?
I'm ready.
Okay, Thomistic metaphysics is probably not a phrase that you want to use in a second grade class, but what it means is that if we were to explain what God is, right? I mean, a second grader can certainly understand what God is. Aquinas defines God as a pure act of being. Okay, so you want to see God not as a thing, but as an action. Okay, so a pure act of being. So God is doing something, okay? He's not just static. He's not just kind of sitting there watching the world. He's actually an act. All right, so do you think a second grader could understand that God is an act?
I think so. Yes, I think so.
Okay, that wasn't 100%.
Listen, I am still processing it myself, so I was like, "Am I just a really bad fourth grader?" Or is it?
Well, yeah, no. Sometimes it's harder to understand. It's kind of even like the simpler things sometimes than the more complicated. But okay, so if God acts, and then the other thing that, okay, this is going to get a little bit complicated. Okay, let's see if we can understand this. Is that we as human persons have both existence and essence. Okay, so but everything in the world has an essence, like a butterfly or a mountain or a cat or a pig or this pen that I'm holding right here in my hand. They all have essences. Okay, but those are all different. Okay, my essence is different than the pen's. My essence is different than that microphone or that wall. But what we share is existence. Okay, that's what we all have in common. Now, I think a second grader could understand that. All right, little Sally, you exist. Ben, you exist. Freddie, you exist. Marie, you exist. The pen exists. The wall exists. The building exists. Your principal exists. Okay. So we all have existence, but our essence is different. So what Aquinas says is that the essence is what limits existence. Okay, so existence, he describes it. Peter Kraft describes it as a river with no banks. Like God is a river with no banks. He just flows. Okay, he is just existence, and then you have all these things. All these essences, all this stuff in the world, and each one exists. And so you have the pure act of being, which is God, that is holding all these things in existence. So there you have the relationship between God and every single thing that exists. And all the second graders are like, teacher, can you ask this man to leave?
Can it be snack time now?
Yeah, right. Can we take a nap? This isn't making any sense.
Rudra on YouTube is asking, well, he's not really asking, he's more like saying God is a person. He is not an impersonal force.
Yeah, okay. No, very good. Good. So that's Rudlo, is that his name?
Yeah, Rudro. I don't think I'm saying Rudro.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm going to stop trying to, I'm so sorry.
I think that when you think of like an impersonal force, I think of like Star Wars, you know, the force is with you. But I don't know, I'm not a big Star Wars fan, but I don't think that the Star Wars force, you know, whatever that means in that series, I don't think it was personal. And so I think maybe that's what Rudro is getting at, is that God is not an impersonal force, but he is a person. And, well, he's three persons, right? And so it's like the three persons in the Godhead are that which is most perfect in all of nature. So are the angels, and so is the human person. Now, okay, I don't know if I could explain this to a second grader or not, but the person has an the human person, let's just say, we have an infinite desire to know, and we have an infinite desire to seek the good. The knowledge part has to do with our intellect. The goodness part has to do with our will. Okay, so I'll ask Sissel, okay, since she's the low hanging fruit.
Okay.
Have you ever in your life? Okay, so you read books and you listen to Catholic radio and you study and you're always, you know, I know you're a seeker of knowledge and all that, but have you ever in your life just gotten to a point where you're like, you know what, I think I'm done. I think I know everything I need to know. I'm going to stop
Every day. Yeah, every day. Absolutely. No,
I mean,
never.
Think about that. I mean, every single one of us is constantly trying to learn stuff. I mean, even like a high school kid who's like, I hate school, you know, but then they'll go home and they'll, you know, get on TikTok and they'll watch videos. Why? Because we're always trying to expand our knowledge, right? We have a constant desire for goodness. We have a constant desire to know things. Okay, that's our intellect and that's our will. And so a person being the most perfect thing in all of nature, and I hope I can explain this well, it means that we have an infinite desire for both of those. And it never really gets filled, especially here on earth, right? So we encompass everything. St. Thomas Aquinas says that the passive intellect of a person can extend to universal being, right? So everything can be known, okay? And we're constantly desiring things, okay? A dog and a cat and a earthworm and a badger do not have that. They don't have this infinite desire to know and to learn, okay? So hopefully, if nothing else, you're beginning to maybe see a little bit about what Dr. Peter Kraft and Karol Wojtyła and some of these other great philosophers have talked about, where we're trying to find a marriage between what St. Thomas Aquinas established in the 13th century with Thomistic metaphysics and the modern personalism, right? Of kind of focusing on the person and our experience in the world and how that's all tied together with sanctification and sainthood and that kind of stuff, okay? I don't know if I'm making any sense, but let's just move on. Okay, so the next slide just has to do with Thomistic metaphysics, and I told you that it very much has to do with existence and essence, with a premium on existence, okay? So existence is what we all share. God is existence itself, and so that kind of highlights the relationship between God and us, right? Because he is existence and we exist, right? All right, so the next slide has to do with personalism. And I love this little picture here on the left because it shows, well, the one on the right is, you know, a young lady, and she's a person, and she's, you know, got all these qualities that we're talking about, the intellect and the will and all that kind of stuff. But the one on the left is kind of cool because it's just kind of us in the world, you know, and we're all kind of trying to figure out what's going on and what's this all about and all that. And so the next slide has what's called a subjective turn to personalism. And what Kraft gets at is that in the Middle Ages, things the Middle Age philosophers like Aquinas and these kind of guys, Bonaventure and Albert and all that, were really looking out at the world and trying to figure out what it was all about, right? It was a very objective type of, philosophy, I guess you could say. And then beginning in the 17th century with the guy on the left here on your screen that you'll see, René Descartes, he revolutionized philosophy because he asks this question about, he says, I think, therefore I am. So by saying I think, therefore I am, I mean, the pronoun I is used twice in that short sentence. So what he's doing is he's bringing it into the human person. And he's saying, okay, I want to see the world from my perspective. In fact, I'm not even going to believe anything just because my senses are telling me something exists. I'm only going to believe it because it's my mind, right? And then you have the guy in the middle, which is David Hume, and he was the empiricist, and he only trusted experience and the experience of the outside world. And then the third guy is Immanuel Kant, and we've talked about him a lot in this program about the Copernican revolution of philosophy. But the point is in the modern philosophers highlighted by these three took a more subjective approach. What does it mean to me? What does the world mean to me? And we also have talked about existentialism, where it goes so far as not only is it my experience of the world, but I kind of create myself the way I want to be. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, these kind of guys, right? So that's the kind of the dichotomy there. We've got the metaphysics, and we got the subjective personalism, and Kraft is saying, is there any way that we can try to marry these together, right? So let's see. I have here on this last one a quote from Vatican II: "Man is the only creature that God wills for its own sake," which means that, as we mentioned last week, that everything else in the world is at the service of man, even the angels, right? Everything else is at the service of man. And then Karol Wojtyła, back in 1961, wrote this great paper called Thomistic Personalism, right? And so that's kind of the crux of it. Is there any other comments or anybody saying anything?
Yeah, hold on just a second. I was just catching up on some of them right now. And yes, we have Milan, who is on YouTube, and he says that this is literally the only interesting Christian stream he stumbled on. And
he finds it interesting.
Yes, yeah. He said that he finds it interesting, and he's sad that we only have a few views, as opposed to some of the creationist flat earther streamings that have a lot more views. Well, that is just how the cookie crumbles sometimes with the YouTube algorithm. We'll have our day,
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think a lot of people would be the exact opposite. It would be like, oh, this is too deep. I think. I don't know. I want bringing in another conversation also that Milan has been talking about is a little bit about the proof of the existence of God, and he's very well aware of St. Thomas Aquinas' 5. I see.
Yeah,
okay.
But he says that he finds that they seem to be more purely proofs for brutally abstract deism, not pointing or justifying any particular religion with a more defined personal God. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree. And I think, what was his name? Milan?
Yes.
Milan. I think that Aquinas was intentionally trying to make these, and of course he borrowed them from Aristotle. I mean, he for the most part, Aristotle had come up with these first, but Aquinas was trying to prove God's existence philosophically rather than theology, because Aquinas acknowledges that when you appeal to authority, it's the weakest form of argument. So if I'm arguing with somebody, let's say I'm arguing with a Protestant, and I say, oh, well, Pope Leo the 14th says this. Well, I'm appealing to authority, and it's an authority that he doesn't accept. Or if I'm arguing with an atheist and I said, well, in Romans chapter 8, verse 3, it says this, well, the atheist is going to say, well, I don't believe in your Bible, so what's the point, right? So Aquinas in the Five Proofs, and Aristotle, of course, being a pagan philosopher, a religious man, and a believer, but not Christian, obviously, because he lived before Christ. But what Aquinas is trying to do is he's trying to appeal to reason, trying to just say that we can reason that God exists, and without having to appeal to what he would call sacred doctrine, the Bible or tradition of the Catholic Church or something like that. And so I think in that regard, it might come across as a little like deistic, as you said, or maybe a little bit more impersonal. But then I think also this is the very, very early on in the Summa. This is the second question of the Summa, where St. Thomas Aquinas gets into these proofs for the existence of God. And as you travel deeper into the Summa, you're going to see that the God of St. Thomas Aquinas, the God of Christianity, is very, very personal. Especially when it comes to him taking on human flesh of Jesus Christ and in the incarnation, which doesn't come until much later in the Summa, right? So, anyways, I'm glad you appreciate the conversation, and the only way to increase viewers is to just keep on doing things that some people may like, and you can tell your friends about it, and maybe we can build up a little bit of a community talking about these kind of things. All right, anything else, Sissel?
I think that's it for now. Yeah.
Okay, that's it. All right. Well, I don't think we'll go a full hour today, and I just wanted to kind of see if anybody else out there has any questions, any conversation points. And again, this is just kind of throwing this topic out there, and I would really recommend you go on YouTube and just do a search for Peter Kreeft, Kreeft, and then put in like Thomistic Metaphysics and Personalism or something like that, and you're going to see the video pop up. I think it's about 40 minutes long. And unless you're like an uber genius, you're probably going to need to watch it a few times to make sense of it. Like I said before, I've watched it about 5 or 6 times, and every time I watch it, it makes a little bit more sense to me. But
this is the Word on Fire one, is that right?
Yeah. So do you see it there?
I found it. Yes.
Okay.
I'm gonna try to drop it somewhere where people can see it.
Okay. Yeah. Put it up in the.
I know
YouTube.
they don't love in the chats the links, but we can try. We'll give it a shot.
Okay. So, I'm trying to think of any of the other real nuggets that come from this, but Kreeft does a really good job of explaining how Thomas is very. He's focused on existence, because I think that his point is that if you focus on the essence of God, like what God is, rather than that he is, his existence, the essence is so different from us. His essence is so transcendent above us. In essence, it transcends us so phenomenally much that if you take God and then you take an angel, you take us, you take a grub worm, they're so different. But his point is that if we focus on existence rather than essence, then we can see that we have a lot more in common with God, where God is existence itself, but we exist. And like I said, everything else in the world exists. So it's what we all have in common. But rather than being existence itself, we just exist, but we also have an essence. So that's kind of the crux of Thomistic metaphysics. And I think that's one of the big contributions that Aquinas had to metaphysics, is the kind of the focus on existence. And then, as I mentioned before, and I'll kind of conclude with this, is if you consider that God holds all things in existence as existence, and if you consider each one of us having a different essence, and that the whole kind of purpose is to come to some kind of level of perfection, well, the greatest perfection will be to what degree God is present in us, right? And by the way, at the very end of the Summa, when he talks about the heavenly experience and what it's like in heaven, and I won't be able to get into a whole lot of description about this, but he describes heaven as the divine essence becoming the form of our intellect, where that union is that God so intimately unites to us that he actually becomes our form. It's kind of hard to even imagine that, but that's the heavenly experience. And I can't just imagine how beautiful that's going to be. So, but here on earth, the greatest reflection of, divinity is going to be in the saints, where the saints who are so amazingly sanctified that God basically lives within them. And you've often heard about, it's not really I who lives, but Christ in me. St. Paul said that. So if Christ is living in us, that might be a little bit of a foreshadowing of what that heavenly experience will be when we are literally united with God in the afterworld. Okay? This wasn't exactly a lecture for a second grader, was it? Okay, so I'm sorry, but the point is the more I learn it, eventually it will be able to be explained more simply, but it's only through my lack of being able to understand it thoroughly that I have to explain it in more technical terminology. So my apologies. And Sissel, last roundup, anything else, or have we exhausted all the comments?
I think we've exhausted pretty much all the comments. I'll just do this last one from Rudro, which is Rudro. He is putting in a verse from Romans 1, verse 20. God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, which I thought was great.
Oh, man.
Good call up.
you just extended the show like 3 minutes, Rudro. Sissel's like, man, I thought we were going to be done. I was going to get back to my graphics. But no, Aquinas uses this verse. Man, I wish Rudro was right here. I wish we were like hanging out, or sitting at a cafe, because I get a feeling Rudro is a pretty bright guy. But no, that verse from Romans, chapter 1, verse 20 that you just quoted, the invisible attributes of God have been made known by what by what he has made. And that is the explanation of basically natural law, that we can know the invisible attributes of God. We can know that God exists through his effects. And St. Thomas Aquinas quotes that verse of Scripture quite often in the Summa Theologia, and obviously St. Paul is using it. And so it's really an argument against atheism. It's an argument against anybody who says, I'm not going to believe in God. And what St. Paul is saying, well, if you just look around at the world and how ordered it is and how beautiful it is and how everything kind of makes sense, then you really don't have an excuse for not believing in a living God who kind of orders all this, moves everything to their final end. And so, no, that was awesome. So thank you for that Bible verse. And that is going to do it. I would like to say, if you would like to join the Back to the Father email list, we typically send out emails every day of the show. Today, I was so bogged down with so many things to do that I apologize I didn't send one out. And but if you'd like to get on the email list, if you're not on it already, just email backtothefather@grnonline.com. Backtothefather@grnonline.com. And Sissel, thank you very much for your help.
Of course. And I'd really encourage everyone to make sure you join us next week, because I think after that day, we're off for a couple weeks.
Oh, yeah.
Because we have the Thanksgiving
right.
holiday here in the U.S., and then we have our share-a-thon, Christmas share-a-thon.
Yeah, good point.
So make sure, put it on your calendar.
Well, we'll have a doozy next week, I promise. And then we'll take a couple of weeks off. And then, come to think of it, I'm going to be taking a couple of weeks off in December. So we are not going to be having a whole lot of shows consistently until probably January. But hopefully we'll have 3 or 4 more before the end of this calendar year. Thanks again. God bless you. And thanks for being part of Back to the Father, a production of Guadalupe Radio Network. God bless you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks for joining us for Back to the Father. And don't forget, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. If you have comments about the show, email Dave Palmer at grnonline.com.